Beloved people of the internet, this is yet another edition of the Hardline According to Stonefruit. Main man, my partner in thought crime, Mark French. How you doing, Mr. French?
So good. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and great to see you.
Wouldn't dream of doing it without you. So today's episode, accompanied as usual with an article at stonefruit.substack.com. And this one is called The Rise of China Since Deng Xiaoping, Domestic Policy and Domestic Attitudes. Quote, the Stones. So obviously any account of the rise of China over the last 40 plus years would have to include the Belt and Road Initiative, BRICS, Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, and the other banks China's created, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Taiwan, their alternative comprehensive economic partnership, military modernization, and other topics. But since you and I have covered these in previous podcasts and myself in previous articles at stonefruit.substack.com, we're going to on the domestic policy, domestic attitude. But because we want this to be a standalone episode, we will be repeating some things here and there that we've already discussed in earlier episodes. So if we bracket the nation that China created in the course of this economic achievement and the horrible labor practices and
Which they are, sure.
Technotronic totalitarianism. I got the word technotronic from what I believe was Zbigniew Brzezinski's first book, Technotronic Age.
That actually doesn't surprise me.
I think it was published around 1972, and he kind of predicted computers and cell phones and technological social control, and he was very prescient and saw a lot of look at those things.
Sure.
And just look at the numbers of China's rise. They are stunning. For example, 20 billion in global trade in 1978, up to 111 billion in 1989. Global trade in 1995. 4.6 trillion in 2018.
Right.
And by 2020, it had 17% of the global exports. And in 2021, its global trade surplus had reached $676 billion.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to do my darndest. There's a nifty little here that charts their rise.
Yeah.
And it is an animated infographic. Let's see if I can work it.
Oh, yeah, that looks great.
See it? Okay, let's.
And everyone else will too.
Far out.
Yeah, that's great.
That once or twice.
Yeah, because you can, when you look at the little the ticker tape race, if you look at it as like a turtle race or a hamster race or whatever, it becomes very, very clear the direction that this goes.
Right. Let's do it again one more time.
Yeah.
Then Germany and Japan, so powerful, we thought they were going to take us over.
Yeah.
Okay, WTO, and boom. See ya. Oh, yeah. Leave you all in dust. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Well, and
So
I mean, this is it's such a fantastic article. Like when you get further along, people will understand how this came about. The United States fully anticipated the entire time that they were going to be able to pull an early 80s Japan with China, and it was just never going to happen.
yeah, I call that the bed of the 90s, and we'll get to that a little later in the podcast.
That's
But
right.
for now, let's look at the bold strokes of
Yeah.
China's rise by looking at the nothing at the beginning to the dominance it has now.
The world had never seen anything like this besides Russia industrializing at the end of the 1800s. It will not be replicated again. Yeah.
Because we've used up all the resources from virtually no trade.
Yeah.
From virtually no trade with the United States in the late 90s, it steadily began accumulating a trade surplus around 1990. But then remember back to that chart when it ascended to the WTO in 2001, it increased to $396 billion trade surplus in 2021, a 25% increase over 2020.
Mm-hmm.
From a negligible share of global manufacturing when Deng Xiaoping took power to 28.7% in 2019.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can't integrate another element here, a long-term view of that trade surplus.
Sure. And I mean, to make that practical for people while you bring this next chart up, look at what that looks like in actual everyday American life. So that's basically what makes the Walton family, one of the richest families on the planet Earth, is when those normalizations to the WTO get made, right? So why does the United States care so much about low prices and price stability? Because they've already made the decision they don't want to pay anybody anything. And if they have to pay you too much, it'll be robots or outsourcing. So this goes back to the Greenspan scared worker syndrome. If we freak them out so bad, we can pay them whatever we want because they'll be scared they won't be able to work, period. So, I mean, people need to start looking at macro policy of every nation as kind of like a bathtub. If you push the water in one spot, it's just going to get higher or lower in another spot, but it all washes to zero. So this is such great work that you did.
Yeah, that's pretty much the main thesis of this overview section of the article and podcast is that American wages stayed flat and China started with absolutely nothing and caught up to America's flat wages. And now if you go by purchase parity power, they are a larger economy than America.
That's right.
But to stick with trade for a minute, here's this new element, a long-term view on US trade with China.
Mm-hmm.
You can see it kind of get on 1990, and this is the bed of the 90s. People like Clinton and the Job of the Hut that won't go away, Larry Sumner's, and Thomas Friedman also.
Right.
Thomas Friedman, they all said with increased trade and engagement and ascension, and China will be a quote unquote responsible stakeholder in the global system and will be the next larger Japan. And we will see why they didn't agree with the West's plans for them as the podcast goes along. But to examine this chart, you see how it rises, and then at WTO at 2001, takes a big dip around the 2008 world financial crisis, and then it just keeps going on and on like a marathon.
Yeah.
And so to finish out just the incredible achievement it has made from an adjusted national per capita income of $141 in 1978
right.
to $7,500 556 from a
Yeah.
GDP of 156 billion in 1978,
Mhm.
14.7 trillion in 2020.
Yeah, that's
From
right.
from a GDP per capita of dineros in 78,
Uh,
134 in 2020.
right. Well, and then
So we've already
listen to the brilliance of the numbers that you just espoused for a moment. $7,500 in a country where your purchasing power is much greater, your healthcare is provided for at a very high level, your education is provided for at a very high level, your housing is subsidized and provided for at a very high level. You're talking about pre-pandemic in the United States, 50% of working people in the United States were only making $30,000 a year or less, in the most debt-ridden society in human history. I guarantee that Chinese 7,500 goes just as far as that American 30 grand.
You're right. China socializes the cost of living cost items that you just referred to. Americans have to pay for it out of, so
Mhm.
that mirror why China is already the largest economy in terms of purchasing parity power, but it will also have a larger GDP than America
That's
in
right.
2020.
Yeah.
And this is 5 years earlier than was previously thought. But I'm making a guesstimation here. I'm thinking it
Sure.
came a little early because of their authoritarian response to the pandemic, allowing to keep production going,
Mm.
and since everyone was stuck at home, shopping worldwide had increased substantially, and that probably helped their international trade balance. But that's what economists call a WAG, which means a wild ass guess.
Mhm.
But in 1980, this is not a wild ass guess. In 1980, China's per capita income was lower than Haiti and Sudan.
Wow.
Now it's one of the two largest economies in the world.
That's incredible.
Haiti and Sudan.
Sudan. That's incredible.
So, as we discussed, over that same period, American wages have been flat.
Mhm.
The real terms, average hourly earnings peaked 45 years ago at $4 an hour. That purchasing power in January 1973 is worth 23 bucks 68 cents today.
which hardly no one gets.
And what's the minimum wage? Like $7 something, and they
$7.25 or
can't
something, like it's ridiculous. Yeah.
even lower. So
Yeah.
it's outrageous. And America's portion of the gross world product peaked at 50% in 1950, and it's
Mhm.
projected to be a paltry 15% in 2024. But dig this, my man, Mark. You know who's not starving? The Department of Defense.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Mhm.
their budget request for fiscal year 2022 was $722 billion. The Biden administration said, "Oh, why don't you go get yourself some nice things? Here, we'll tack on another $30." So the Biden administration's request to Congress was $753 billion. And then the House Armed Services Committee said, "Yeah, you still don't have enough nice stuff. let's tap on almost 25 billion to $778 billion.
Mhm.
So that's $56 billion more than they even asked for.
So it's $11 billion more than canceling all student debt in 1 year.
It just shows you where
yeah.
China's lifting and Congress and the executive branch, slave to the warmongers, the merchants of death, do not think of that and only think of more war.
Yeah.
So let's set the stage of how Deng Xiaoping got to power. In the 11th National Congress in August, Deng emerged on top. And he bested Mao's chosen successor, Hua Guofeng. And next year, in December 1978, the Chinese Communist Party's 11th Central Committee convened. And Deng's program of reform and opening up to the outside world won the day. 改革开放. Deng released a number of iconic phrases into circulation that people who are familiar with. To get is glorious. Some must get rich first. It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches. But to describe his initial approach to, quote, reform and opening up to the outside world is the subtitle of the stonefruit.substack.com article, Cross the River by Feeling the Stones. And someone who grew up in tropical Hawaii and in the beaches, that's exactly how you cross a river.
Yeah.
Moja Shi told Guohe. Cross the river by feeling the stones. So the river that they had to cross was from a closed Marxist, centrally planned economy, relatively open, liberalized and market driven, but definitely subordinate to the party. So in the countryside, communes transitioned into individual farms. In the household response, so Deng comes to power, full tilt boogie in December 1978. This is pretty rare. I just learned about this in my research for this article. 19 farmers in Xiaogang province of Anhui drew up a secret agreement to farm their commune between their 18 families individually. But they knew that the Congress that Deng came to power in, or the plenum that Deng came to power in, individual farming like that. So part of their agreement was that the other farmers would take care of their kids until they were age 18 in case they ever were sentenced to death. But it got people's attention, their secret was exposed, and it became a few years until the experiments proliferated and it became official party policy. And by 1984, production had increased from 30 billion kilograms of agricultural production when it was all collective to 400 billion kilograms. So they started with dramatically improving their agricultural production. Of course, the IMF and World Bank were opposed to it because they said it lacked the one thing that would foster individual responsibility an initiative, and long-term investment, private property. And Joseph Stiglitz, there's a link to a lot of this stuff at Substack. He said, and he had this dramatic pause, dramatic for an economist.
Sure.
He goes, "We said it would never work, but it did." Introducing competition and incentives into the economy worked better than property rights. Another sector that started improving were township and village enterprises.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't necessarily owned by townships and villages. The commune held the ownership rights, so managers and operators had the use rights. And half were located on coastal provinces and were participating in China's burgeoning export economy. So the German economist Isabella Weber is wonderful on how China avoided that the township and village enterprises used existing social capital, institutional infrastructure, and local monitoring for the township and commune to convert to an industrial economy.
Mm-hmm.
So they became a really vibrant sector, and employment expanded from 28,078 to 135 million in 1996, and revenue went up from 49 billion yuan in 1978 to 1.8 trillion yuan in 1992.
Wow.
Right? But Jiang Zemin, Chinese entrepreneur, there was increased competition by this point. Some of them did formally privatize, and a official preference for foreign firms caused that sector to wither away by the 1990s.
Yeah, the section that you just read, it made so many great points. So you have, people like Joe Stiglitz and Jeffrey Sachs and Robert Reich, Yellen, who's a Yale person that's now at the Fed. So that group of people that you just mentioned that were eyeballs deep in policy at that time, and only looking through a Western lens, and not just a Western lens, but an American hegemonic lens. Some of those have finally come to the realization, like, we went a little bit too far and we were just flat out wrong on some of this stuff. So I actually appreciate some of them more now at the tail end of their career or being semi-retired, when they choose to tell the truth about some of the policies that they ended up writing and being engaged in and advocating for at the time, and they have the self-respect to admit that they were just flat out wrong. And then another great point that you just made is the boom in agriculture. So when you look at the math of that, rice-based agricultural societies can provide their populace with 4.5 times more calorie content per person per acre than wheat-based agriculture. So you have Europe and the West being predominantly wheat-based, and then you have China that has the ability to be rice-based. So when that happens, you get a lot more bang for your buck feeding your people with rice. And that made a huge difference in the boom that they were able to pull off in that way.
I didn't know you could get 4 times the calorie growing rice than wheat.
That's right.
I always say, thank God I grew up in Hawaii so that I could tolerate Southeast Asia's having rice at every meal.
Yeah.
But the agricultural sector, beyond the township and village enterprises sector, the special economic zones that were created in 1980 in South China need to be discussed as well. And they were established near all resistant centers of trade and finance. They made one at Zhuhai near Macau, Shenzhen, big one now, near Hong Kong, Xiamen and Shantou near Taiwan. The emphasis was technology and capital to assist with China's growth. So to incentivize foreign firms, they were allowed to hire and fire labor, which is a departure from the party's typical lifetime job guarantee. They were given access to container port shipping infrastructure. They were provided rights and offered tax incentives. By the mid-'80s, they were an economic force. And here's some factoids that tell you how important. By 1986, the 12 coastal provinces were only 14% of the country's land area and 41% of the country's population, and yet they were responsible for of the industrial output and 79% of foreign trade. Now, this export-based economy was formalized in a December 1988 speech to coastal. Third Premier of People's Republic of China, 1980, Vice Chairman of the party, 1981 to 82, Party General Secretary from 1987 to 1989. You know, I'm a B-rank China watcher maybe, and I don't know what all these titles mean because it never, it doesn't always equate to who's really got the juice.
Right, yeah.
But in any Zhao Zhiyuan did have the juice, and he was in strategy. And he told those officials, quote, "We can find a way to promote the export-oriented economy in the coastal areas while ensuring the smooth implementation of the policy of improving the economic and order. We should increase technological exchanges with foreign countries by fully using China's manpower, technology, infrastructure, and industrial ability."
Yep.
And their model, tigers, South Korea and Taiwan. So Weber, Isabella Weber, that great German economist, she said that they used, quote, cheap disciplined labor, end quote, to make these low-skill manufacturing centers attract foreign direct the trade surplus in gradually the manufacturing value chain, enhancing their technological base, incorporating Western management techniques. So in 1986, every good George Soros paid for a delegation from China to visit Hungary and Yugoslavia to study their economic systems.
Yeah.
At the time, they were the leading examples of how to integrate aspects of free enterprise. But that plans the Chinese leadership had for shock therapy and sudden price liberalization. And good thing too, because it soon plunged Russia and Eastern Europe into chaos.
That's Larry Summers. He would have happily taken that to China if they would have allowed it.
You mentioned some of those folks, economists that all work together. Like Yellen went to school with Richard Wolff at Yale.
That's right. Yeah, polar opposites.
Yeah.
Right.
Some of them have Maximus Culpa, and my favorite one of that crew who has is Jeffrey Sachs.
Right. Yeah.
He was part of the delegation that privatized Russia.
Sure.
But since then, he has become one of my
Well,
disavow what he did in Russia.
yeah,
But
I mean,
so
he told it. Him telling the truth about how wrong they were completely redeems him from actually doing it in the first place. I don't begrudge a man that thinks he's doing the right thing at any time of his life, and he thinks that he's advancing the values of his company, his philosophy, his ethics, his country. I don't for 1 second think that Jeffrey Sachs is a cynical actor. I think he participated with Larry Summers and in privatizing and creating the Russian oligarchy during the breakup of the Soviet Union. I think all those guys at the time, at that point in the careers, really truly did believe in what it was that they were doing. It just turned out to be wrong. So anybody like Larry Wilkerson on the geopolitical side, anybody that's willing to tell the truth and go, hey, I need to own up on this one, didn't get that one quite right. And it really changed things, and it set a bad precedent. And now I'm just going to attempt to tell the truth. I really, really respect Sachs for that, and some of the other ones. Summers, on the other hand, yeah.
I hope he chokes on a donut.
Yeah, he's going to hell.
Since you brought up the Larry Wilkerson example, and another geostrategist that I'd throw in that category is Chalmers Johnson.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
He used to work for the Rand Corporation.
Yeah, and was at Berkeley for a really long time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he said that he's spear carrier for empire, but his trilogy of
it's brilliant. It's one of the most relevant works. Yeah.
Blowback, Nemesis, I forget the third, but those three are just
they're incredible. Yeah.
So, yeah, people that see the light are out there.
Mm-hmm.
So, let's look at late 70s and into the 80s again, too. In 1977, China reinstated college entrance exams, and it was booming. That was also importing.
I'll still be able to hear you. I have to step away. Keep talking.
Surely. Yeah, and as the export trade continued to blow up, that also imported democracy, capitalism, Western management techniques, etc. Some really bad inflation in 1988. I can't get exact figures, but it looks to be around 18 to 26%. And I would say the Tiananmen massacre of 1989. Although a journalist I really respect, Danny Haifong, believes that Tiananmen was a color revolution with substantial Western covert support. I have not. I'm very curious to know more. So Zhao Ziyan's political career did not survive Tiananmen, but the coastal development strategy based on exports did. So according to Robert Spalding, in the course of researching my podcasts, and this proves what an open-minded guy I am, because he's from the right. He was a strategic planning director with the National Security Council. He was architect of Cito Mussolini's national security strategy.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be a big strategy, very powerful, a lot of strength. And he was the China strategist for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said that after Tiananmen, the party went into a period of self-reflection, and they felt under attack, like the Soviet Union was in the final years, and they developed many years. And most important was that they should never separate from the Chinese people. So they knew they had to focus on the economy and deliver basic material advancement for the masses. Most importantly, perhaps, they needed a new narrative to replace the old socialist one. So they're deeming the country from the, quote, century of nation at the hands of foreign powers, beginning with the Opium Wars and not ending until the announcement of the People's Republic in 1949.
Which makes it kind of easy because I think over 75% of the population identifies as Han or self-identifies, yes?
Identifies as what?
Han
Yeah,
Chinese.
it's in the low 90s, I believe.
Oh, got it. There it is.
Yeah, constitutionally, they're supposed to give the minorities a lot of rights, but as a practical matter, they do not.
Yeah.
And they suffer quite a bit at the hands of the party and the Han people.
Mm-hmm.
But that narrative of what they had to endure in the century of humiliation is really resounding to them. And they really buy into it wholeheartedly.
Sure.
And when we get to the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, we can really see how much they bought into it.
Mm-hmm.
So a key figure in the economic reforms of the 1990s was Vice Premier Zhu Rongji. And he squeezed access to credit for the state-owned enterprises, beginning in 1993 to control inflation. His reform vision was to enhance state authority over the larger ones and to allow the smaller ones to be privatized. And in the pithy manner of the Chinese, there was a force which was 抓大放小, grasp big, release the small. As inflation reached 21% by December 19, an austerity program. By February 1997, it was down to 6%. Due to his forceful personality, a bit of a unusual thing in a country that prizes consensus and avoiding confrontation,
Mm-hmm.
got legislation passed in 1995 that allowed state-owned themselves as commercial entities and the creation of a central bank. Although his reform of state-owned enterprises increased unemployment, like virtually all leaders, he really valued stability overall. Turbulent things like futures market. Now let's take a little trip down to Yuan, Mr. French.
Mm-hmm.
In the late 1997, early 1998 Southeast Asian currency crisis, people think had this dirty George Soros on it again. But whoever was responsible, whatever market forces were responsible, it convinced Chinese leadership that they had made the right choice in not letting the yuan float as free. Although they changed the name of the state administration to the State Administration for Foreign Exchange in 1997, still the yuan is not fully convertible 25 years later. From 1995 to 2005, 0.28 pegged to the USD. In July 2005, they announced the immediate revaluation to 8.11 to 1 USD as a very temporary stopgap until they matched it related basket of currencies from. Now, I sleuthed around trying to find who those partners were, but the currencies I could find were the dollar, the euro, and the yen.
Sure.
In 2015, they lowered the peg again to 7 yuan. And next year, the IMF added the yuan to IMF's special drawing rights, which is a basket of currencies that the IMF uses to settle international accounts.
Mm-hmm.
Let's look at what it was in 2010 and who currencies lost when the yuan came in. 41.9% in 2010, lowered to 41.73, not much. Euro was 30.93 in 2010. Oh no, it was 37.4 in 2010. 30.9 when the renminbi came in. Renminbi came in at 10.9. The yen took a hit, a small one, 9.4 in 2010 to 8.3. The pound took. Sound is the pound, baby.
Right.
One with the USD now, baby, not as sound. But back in
Right.
2010, it was 11.3% of special drawing rights, and when the yuan came up, 8%.
Yeah.
So in
Well, and then just to put a face on the numbers that you just stated for everyone, look at the timing and the way that coincided with what that looked like in real life for everyone. So you have the euro taking a hit, right? Deutsche Bank is in literal crisis right now. You have Crédit Agricole in France at like 284% of GDP. No wonder it's taking a hit. Everyone knows that the euro is based on a house of cards, right? So they fake bail out Greece just to pay back their own banks. Not unlike the quantitative easing that's happening here in New York. So because China's money is actually based on making things and employing people and infrastructure, it makes sense as everyone else wakes up and goes, hey, wait a second. There's a bunch of accounting tricks and games and quantitative easing central bank hypnosis over here, and then there's actual things happening over here. Of course, that's going to take place at some point. And if it continues to transpire in that direction, people are just going to consider the China, Russia, BRICS bloc, whatever monetary system they choose to participate in together. It's just going to give it more and more legitimacy as things move forward. Like the pound sterling, you bring up Bretton Woods quite often. I mean, the pound sterling was in place all the way until the Suez Canal debacle. And then it collapsed immediately, which put the dollar in place. Like, people don't understand the speed with which a hegemonic currency can collapse, especially if everyone else decides that it's not based on anything legitimate other than a banking cartel backed by a gigantic mafia-style military.
Yeah, the Western currencies are based on the fire sector and the clerical service sector, especially service sector of labor, which is not much, but Russia and China commodities. So back to the journey of the yuan over the years. In May 2022, this year, the IMF actually raised the yuan's weight from 10.9 to 12.2%. And the dollar rose a little too, but the yuan.
Yeah.
So that is the sidebar into the yuan, and back to the ongoing timetable of China's development. In 1997, Wang Xianggui, two senior Chinese Air Force colonels, quote, participated in a massive military exercises aimed at intimidating Taiwan during the run-up to that island's first presidential elections, end quote. In response, groups through the Taiwan Strait, but he chickened out to send a third one because I think China said something like, "You will see a storm of fire if you send another carrier through." And Clinton was, we'll take a pass. But Chiao met in a small town in the province that's across the straits from Taiwan, Fujian. Most of the Taiwanese Han are from Fujian. And
yes.
And they reflected on those incidents, technology that America used in Gulf War 1.0, and how China should respond to that high-tech based military. Now, I got turned on to this from a podcast, Marshall, The Realignment with Sagar, interviewed Robert Spalding, who had a book out on War Without Rules, because War Without Rules proved to be so prescient. Those authors saw the avoidance of casualties, primary motivation behind what Americans were starting to call the revolution in military affairs. And you see that phrase all over in the Project for a New American Century manifesto, the Neocon manifesto par excellence, which came out around 2000. Authors of War Without Rules said it's just using expensive against inexpensive targets.
Right.
So instead of trying to keep up with the United States in the evolution of technology and the extraordinarily high costs, they said, let's not be bound by the rules of war that the West set up for their advantage anyway. And also, since the West sees war purely as kinetic war, why doesn't China just update that for modern times, that the best, most brilliant victory is one that is won without fighting? So Spalding reckons that these concepts evolved into a six-front war of the economy, military, diplomacy, and infrastructure. Now, Mark French, let me lay on my conspiracy theory on you. Given that China can really do totalitarian control over any society that it feels like controlling.
Right.
Could the ease with which Mexican cartel to mix into their North traffic be the ultimate paybacks a bitch motherfucker for the Opium Wars that destroyed China in the 1840s?
If people don't think China's not aware of the Opium Wars and what that did to them, I have a bridge to sell you.
I think China is acutely aware of the Opium Wars.
They are acutely aware. What do people think that policy comes from?
Yeah, that's the cornerstone.
At the same time, it increases their GDP while also putting a bunch of their students to work that actually are good at STEM and chemistry. It kills two birds with
Yeah.
one stone. It gives people good jobs. I mean, it's that that would not shock me in the slightest. They are well aware of that.
You know, hidden video to kind of own the libs on different occasions.
Yeah, right, sure. Yeah, it's funny. They get some good bites.
They get some good stuff, and they do own the
They get
libs
some good
sometimes.
stuff. Yeah.
I saw some undercover video like that of some fentanyl in just an open China. A lot of markets in China are just a gigantic warehouse, and then there's hundreds of stalls within the warehouse and some offices in the warehouse. And
Sure.
this was some rando off the street got it with if you speak Mandarin and you know where to look, you can get fentanyl.
Absolutely. No doubt about it.
So then the problem is just getting it to Mexico and pouring it into the heroin and everything else. Now it's getting into pills and stuff too.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, the Indians are also well versed at reverse engineering chemicals. So they have their own synthetic heroin and fentanyl problems because they're very good at reverse engineering. There is a large part of the population that wants to be sedated for whatever their personal reasons are, and it's a real issue in some places over there.
That Ramones song, I wanna be sedated.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, right. Let's go surf and then get trashed.
I saw the Darjeeling Express, the Wes
Oh
Anderson
yeah,
movie,
Wes Anderson. Yeah, that's great.
and I guess it had some kind of opioid. They were just drinking it throughout the whole movie. And I looked at more than one pharmacy in India looking for it. I never found it.
Yeah.
But so now we're on our timeline at the May 7th, 1999 NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, Secretary of Defense William Cohen said it was tragic and a deeply regrettable mistake.
Sure.
One of our planes attacked the wrong target because the bombing instructions were out of date. Uh-huh. Really?
Yeah.
Photography in the mid-90s, and I was using a GPS when it came out, pretty much.
Yeah.
And in the mid-90s, they still had what they called selective exemption, which meant that the military put in or not put in your coordinates being off by 6 feet, just so that it wouldn't be what was perfect. Exactly where that bomb was going. And it was the only raid of the air campaign coordinated by a drumroll, the CIA. And George Tenet said, aiming for the Yugoslav Directorate of Supply Procurement. It was a few hundred meters, but it's the same street. Two-man crew of a B. Can you imagine to render that much death? Flying at 40,000 feet or whatever their incredible cruising altitude is, it flew from Missouri to Yugoslavia. Well, back when the media still had journalism, a few months later in October 9, the Observer, the Guardian in London, and Politiken in Copenhagen both published stories saying that the attack was deliberate because the embassy was being used for military communications after the previous broadcast, and then they put it to Milosevic's home by NATO bombing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the concept of extraterritoriality, that embassies and consular offices are foreign territory. They are the territory of that nation. The diplomatic law that came out of the century of humiliation, remembered by the Western powers. So embassies should be sacrosanct. So the French Defense Ministry, who like to tweak the nose of, they said that the bombers, and that, quote, part of the military operations were conducted by the United States outside of the strict framework of NATO. And Secretary of State, may she not rest, called any accusations that the attack was deliberate balderdash. Now, if you're reaching for an arcane word like balderdash, I think you've got a guilty. Well, tens of thousands of Chinese protested for days after that bombing.
Sure.
At
yeah,
the embassy,
absolutely.
At the embassy in Beijing and in consular offices across China.
Yeah.
And central government, the party, which could have shut it down immediately, it was a test run for them to see how effective their new narrative of the century of humiliation and was working. Like a test drive of this new narrative, see how much public support this bombing. And it was tens of thousands out on the street in front of consular offices, and the U.S. ambassador was trapped for 4 days.
Yeah.
And then they made nice and gave each other some millions. Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and China gave America's to the U.S. embassy and consular offices.
Sure.
So we talked about the bet of the 90s, Clinton, Sumner's, Friedman, that if we just open markets, China's going to be. And of course, that didn't quite work.
No.
Look at some more elements here. Not that one. What do I want to show? This one is a China's trade balance with America. Here we go. Can you see that one?
Not yet.
Bear with me, faithful listeners.
Elements went away momentarily.
Elements 101. Stonefruit is trying to share elements.
Well, you switched it to the screen, so that's good. There it is. Yeah, it's there.
There we go. I care about you, the viewer. I want to increase the technical values and production values of this estimable podcast. Rise to manufacturing dominance. This is 2018, and the yellow line is China, and you can see they switched places on 2009.
Yep.
And America's steadily declining, and China's steadily rising.
Yep.
And another way to look at it, our chart here from 2010 to 2020.
Yeah.
And that 10% little green bar is American exports to China.
Right. Yeah. Well, the two charts
One,
that you just showed as well clearly indicate. So Barack Obama had just taken office 18 months before the first chart. So
yeah,
you can tell that he was well aware of these numbers, especially with Bob Rubin from Citigroup handing him his entire appointment list. They were aware of these machinations. So it becomes blatantly obvious why in 16
right.
or 17, at the end of his presidency, in the secret of the night, he tried during a bunch of midnight sessions to try and jam the TPP down everyone's throat.
Yeah. No. So that shows you once they ascended to the WTO, they started moving.
Yeah.
Haul ass. The exports just skyrocketing.
Mm-hmm.
And for China's membership in the WTO thought that it would not only be a bottomless new market, but maybe even an investor in Western financial instruments.
Right.
This never happened to the extent of Wall Street's grandest hopes.
Right.
Those T-bill auctions, but before long they were plowing all the reserves the foreign reserves that they gained from treasury bills into doing basically what Eisenhower did in the 50s that put America in such a good position for so many decades. Well,
Mm-hmm.
decades, 20 years. And
Sure.
what Eisenhower did, China did, spending heavily on infrastructure, prioritizing STEM education, research and development, and
Yep.
cultivating the industrial base.
Yep.
All while the United States is going deeper and deeper into a $5 trillion with flat wages.
Mm-hmm.
Years that I haven't taken a real deep dive into the infrastructure bill, but I assume it's a lot like the CARES Act, and a lot of it went to Wall Street and big corporations.
It's just another fake handout. It's just more helicopter money for people that don't need it. It's just to legitimize their stock buybacks and profits, to act like this is the Thatcher way. There is no other alternative. This is the Reagan Thatcher model. I mean, this is what that looks like. Without all of this fake money, all of these fairy tales that they've been spinning for 40 years come tumbling down without this constant aquarium bubble blowing. It's bubble everything. 08 was subprime housing. Now it's just bubble everything. They did it to cars. They did it to student debt. They did it to credit card debt. I mean, on and on and on. This is just constant blowing up of fake bubbles.
Yeah, our bridges are falling down.
Literally. The Twin Cities had a bridge collapse in rush hour traffic. An American bridge collapsed. People like to make fun of Chinese infrastructure and not planning for sinkholes and things of that nature. An American bridge collapsed in an American city in rush hour traffic and killed a bunch of people. And no one even talks about it anymore. It's insane. All of this stuff was built post-World War II. How long do you think it's going to last?
Didn't a dam flood in Wisconsin and it flooded a chemical plant? Something like that?
Yes, on and on and on. The Michigan baby formula scandal, that just got flooded. I mean, it's preposterous.
America has infrastructure problems, but the infrastructure bill addressed it. I will not die on that hill. I want to look into the infrastructure bill a little more. But
of course,
if it really addresses infrastructure in any significant way, I'd be surprised. And what did it finally trillion. We have a $5 trillion arrears, but we're not going to.
No.
That's the beautiful thing about America is it's so heinous in every respect right now, and there's no mechanism for it to get better at all. It is not going to.
No, there isn't. No, Winston Churchill says about the United States, he said about it at one time, America will always end up doing the right thing after it's exhausted every other option. So it's going to get way worse before it gets better.
But meanwhile, look at what China's doing. They put in their first high-speed rail line from Beijing to Tianjin. Tianjin is 60, 70 miles away on the coast, east of southeast.
Sure.
Of Beijing. First line, short one, 2 major cities, 2008. By 2021, they have 25,000 miles of high-speed rail.
Wow.
California voters voted yes on a LA and the Bay Area in 2000.
Yeah. And with a link to Vegas or whatever. Yeah.
14 years later, the end is nowhere in sight. The cost has tripled from about 30 billion to 90 billion.
Yeah.
Projects like Three Gorges Dam, horrible for the environment and horrible for all that got flooded. But as an engineer, from an engineering standpoint, it's certainly mega. Although I've heard some criticisms even about its construction, but big projects like that, development, especially solar, photo prices have been collapsing. And then, as we've said on this podcast often before, Belt and Road Initiative in the world. So China beguiles Wall Street with the promise of gigantic rising American stock prices, client.
Yeah.
And according to a source I like very much for their quality research and nonpartisanness, Congressional Research Service, they said China had the students in the United States in 2018, 100,000, and the largest number of STEM students, 162,000.
Yeah.
Now here's the real conundrum that American leadership has. The political class and what Ray McGovern, the anti-war activist and veteran intelligence professional, called the Mickey Mac. I love that Mickey Mac because it's such a great improvement on the military-industrial complex. He goes, the military-industrial congressional intelligence.
Yeah, it's a fantastic.
So them,
yeah,
it's fun to say, Mickey Mac. So the political class and Mickey Mac, they simultaneously want war.
Right.
And they've even created an acronym, Great Power. They've made an acronym, you know it's serious and dangerous. So they simultaneously want war, but they also want to keep completely engaged with it commercially. But in the process of America declining and China rising, they just stripped 70,000 factories, some of which were just shipped machine by machine, brick by brick to China. And this caused the American labor force to lose 3 manufacturing jobs and 1 million by 4 support jobs that they create. That's 13 million jobs. I don't know where I saw it, but it was someone that part of his job was to go visit American factories. They'd been closed and sold to, and he said that there was a haunting quality to it because it happened so fast that you'd still see people's pictures of their families and their little mementos around where they worked while everything's in the process going across the Pacific.
Absolutely. Well, to add some American color to that, you know, I'm from a blown out ghetto in Southwest Detroit. We have a very high concentration of factories and junkyards. And pre-08, in the mid 2000s, between 2003 and 2000, let's see, I moved from there to LA in 05. So just in the last 2 years that I lived where I'm from as my primary residence, at least 4 of the biggest factories in my neighborhood were dismantled and shipped to China. Literally, all the conveyor belts, all the steel, all the forklifts, like those things were taken apart and shipped to China right in front of all of our faces. So as the neighborhood was in turmoil and in precipitous decline, they literally bought those factories. And then not only that, but all the scrap metal from the places that weren't sold, but they were sitting there idle and empty. Everybody that had lost their job had no choice but to take apart all the wiring and beams. They dismantled their own neighborhood to take it to the scrap yard, and the scrap yard was selling exclusively to China. So they literally dismantled their own industries and scrapped it to give to the Chinese.
It occurred in all of the Rust Belt. Probably the most archetypical, and
not just a
one
Detroit
of my favorite
story. You got that right. Mm-hmm.
But it's definitely a Detroit story. And another guy from Detroit is Rob Johnson, who does the excellent.
Yeah, that's right.
He does the excellent economic podcast, New American Thinking, New Economic Thinking.
Yeah.
And he had a great interview with Jeffrey Sachs. He's had a number of interviews with Jeffrey. What Endel from Detroit. So let's listen to what Jeffrey.
As is your fellow Hawaiian professor from Wayne State, Wayne Dyer, a Taoist.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
So speech from where he's speaking of the Chinese while he's interviewing Jeffrey Sachs. This will be Rob Johnson speaking, and he's trying to be empathetic and speaking from the Chinese perspective of, don't blame us. We didn't cause you guys to lose all these jobs, but we're going to take all the.
Of course.
Dad, China 2025. Rights or access to our financial markets, and we understand. But what we don't understand
is why we
are being
the American leadership,
not just under Trump, but before that.
Engaging in globalization when we're a very country
that had
at the American per capita income,
and the American for their own people,
in the transformation,
in the adjustment assistance, in the reallocation. And the winners
got their taxes cut,
to keep the
money offshore,
exacerbated
class divisions. And we were powerless
to do anything about what we're being blamed for that. And I think
thing to say,
but
yeah, it's an interesting point. You know, I think broadly speaking, the notion in any event that China is somehow a source of major U.S. social ills is trumped up, if I could put it that way, wildly. But I would say more.
So yeah, America just let those dogs and didn't.
Yeah.
While our and so jumping back to the timeline within China of what they were doing to continue expanding their economy is distinct from enterprises. Now, in 2006, their oversight body and holding company, the Assets Supervision and Administration Commission, redefined SOE reform as focusing on industries where state would roll in 9 pillar industries where the state would, quote, direct development, end quote. Now, let's have a gander at what those sectors are. Key industries.
Yeah.
Defense. Oil and gas, telecom, shipping, aviation, rail. So blowing shit up, power, communication, and getting somewhere.
Right. Yep.
Pretty fundamental.
Duh.
And then their pill. And then there's chemicals, construction, electronics, equipment manufacturing, non-ferrous metals.
Yeah.
And prospecting, steel, and technology. And what they call normal industries include tourism, real estate, general manufacturing, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, investment, professional. State-owned enterprises can and remain a durable feature of the Chinese economy and government structure.
Yeah.
And they've survived all these waves of reform since Deng Xiaoping. And their contribution to national output has decreased, but still 40%. Really say that they want the state-owned enterprise to be more responsive to market pressures. The actual ownership of the state in those sectors has remained really steady throughout. And let me try and introduce another steadiness of ownership in those 3 sectors. Key, pillar, and normal.
Wow. Flatline.
Yeah.
Model of consistency.
Right. And that little box, this is animated, so you can get it out of the way,
sure.
and you can see.
Right. The minor
the key
fluctuations are all based on something. Yeah, that's right.
Very minor. I mean, a very, very gradual decrease in state ownership of a few percentage points in each of the key, pillar, and normal sectors, but not really much. Not really that much. So it has feature of the Chinese economy to make it more responsive to the free market, but they're not. But let's look at how the global economy has changed too. And China's been right there, shoulder to shoulder. As America evolved and went to China, big tech, if you go by market capitalization, just blew up. In 2007, the five largest American companies by market capitalization were ExxonMobil, General Electric, Microsoft, 10 years later in 2017, they are Apple, the parent company of Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon.
Right.
So in 2010, and I'm using this number because that's Stiglitz gave a speech to Norwegian. It's been a real font of data for me for this comment, our podcast today. He said that by 2010 should 740 million people out of poverty and created the second largest number of billionaires in the world.
Yeah.
And statement, let's said, most America's growth in GDP. No shit,
how?
Sherlock.
Yeah, right.
So talked about how wages have been flat for decades, same as they were. It reached its peak in 73. They're about the same.
85% of American stock is owned by 10% of stockholders.
Yeah.
The only reason they started connecting 401ks and Roths and pension funds to it is so that anybody with a good enough job that had some kind of retirement plan at their job felt like they had some kind of adherence to the stock market. It was a cynical ploy from the very beginning. It's a joke. The outside of the top 10%, people own a very insignificant amount of stock in this country. They just do. It's not serious.
Yeah.
It's not connected to the real economy here in any way whatsoever.
And the overriding thesis of this podcast and article is that China started with no GDP and no manufacturing.
That's right.
And very low wages and flat during that entire period of China's growth. China caught up. And even passed. And America has remained flat. And America's wages and upward mobility remaining flat for 40. It's going to sound French.
Yeah.
I mean, the deaths of despair, that's by Ann Case and Agnes Deaton of the same name. And that came out in 2020. And to be sure, alcoholism and drug overdose, and suicide deaths, they did all rise during a book that comes out in 2020. They signed the contract in 2018 or 2019, and they were researching it for years before.
Right. It's pre-pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah, they were talking about the forces that capitalism in America had unleashed to create this before the pandemic made it easy.
I think Chris Hedges, along with Matt Taibbi, are two of the most relevant authors in this space. Those two voice these things over and over again in numerous ways of what Hedges refers to as the slow collective suicide happening in the United States, which he refers to from a previous source as anime. So this slow suicidal self-destruction of internalizing all of this trauma, this is what that looks like. And it's pre-pandemic.
It absolutely, and my main man, Chris, is certainly with Cornel West, my two favorite public intellectuals. And he
Sure.
is where I first heard the term deaths of despair.
Mhm.
And the anomie that you mentioned is French sociologist Émile
Durkheim, that's
which
right.
is
Yep. hmm
a foundational text of sociology. And anomie means without social bond. And I
hmm
think it's not just a question of just being flat for 40 plus years. It is
Right.
fusion within battery acids.
Yes, that's right.
The public, they don't connected anymore. There's no civic culture. There's no society.
Mhm. Yeah, that's right.
Meanwhile, back in China, in 2012,
Yeah.
Xi Jinping comes to power. He is a princeling. Prince is a category of people who are the progeny or the laws of people of enormous stature in the early party days, in the early Chinese Communist Party days, in the early days of the People's Republic of China. A lot of them were banned to the Cultural Revolution. Xi Jinping was, but they still carry a lot of clout. And he came to power in 20. He announced One Belt, One Road in 2013, which quickly evolved into Belt and Road Initiative, which extensively on our podcast, the Hardline. And in 2015, China published their manufacturing manifesto, Made in China 2025.
Yeah.
It outlined a national plan to dominate 10 sectors, manufacturing, advanced technologies. And friend of show, frenemy of show for strategic and international studies, drew a little write-up of Made in China 2025. My God, Mark, look at what they were targeting.
hmm
Automated machine tools and robotics, aerospace and aeronautical equipment, maritime equipment and high-tech shipping, modern rail transport equipment, new energy vehicles and equipment, power equipment,
Yeah.
cultural, new
Right.
material, biopharma and its medical products.
Sure.
So it was like dropping the gauntlet to the rest of
Yeah.
the advanced industrial nations that said, we are ready with you at the top of the cutting value chain of industrial technology. And it scared the shit out of Western governments.
Well, I mean, just two of the things. Just pull two of the things that you just said, and look at how ass backwards and preposterous the policy is here. So, because we are advocating for electric cars immediately so fast on this completely snake oil fake American adherence to the Green New Deal or whatever, that's actually just profiting China, because we don't have any of the lithium, we don't have any of the technology. I mean, just the amount of copper wiring in one electric car is 5 times the current amount of copper that goes into a car. So us advocating for this is just going to profit China. And then the other thing that you brought up, just to rub everyone's face in it, at our lack of ideas and dynamism in this space, and how monopolized and encased our current corporate structure is pharmaceuticals. We try and hold these patent rights over everyone to extract, but if anyone else becomes on par with creating pharmaceuticals, what do you think is going to happen if someone else decides to sell the world stuff that's good and effective and a decent product, and you can actually afford to buy it? So, I mean, just those two things alone. And you're talking about healthcare in the United States being very nearly 20% of GDP. And it's the most inefficient, ineffective, parasitic corporate structure on the planet Earth. It's crazy. It's not sustainable.
Yeah, so the West reacted to Made in China 2025, and they said, oh, wait a minute. Aren't you guys making our toys and our clothes and our
Paper mache, yeah.
Wait, weren't you making those plastic tubs I buy at the dollar store?
Yeah.
Wait a minute. You want to be at the cutting edge of biotech? Hey, what, huh?
Yeah.
It entered into Trump's trade war with China,
Mhm.
which he started in January 2018 with the tariffs on, like you mentioned, solar panels for China. Now a world beater, and washing machines.
Right.
And in October 2018, after for tariffs, Pence criticized Made in China 2025 in a speech at the Hudson Institute. And 2019 was first year that Li Keqiang, Premier Li Keqiang, did not mention progress towards Made in 2025 in his annual report. And a lot of our Western allies are starting to cozy up to China and their economic. For example, Greece blocked an EU statement sanctioning China for human rights abuses in the United Nations in 2017. Hungary halted another EU statement that would have criticized China's Hong Kong security law in 2021. A couple reasons why that might be, one of which railroad from Budapest to Belgrade.
Right.
And China is held by Greek debt, and they're expanding the port of Piraeus near Athens. But Piraeus is yet another good case study of, okay, they're building valuable infrastructure, and Piraeus is the largest passenger terminal in Europe, I believe, or maybe just the Mediterranean basin, and it's I think it's the largest trade port in the Mediterranean basin. It's a significant, and they're going to hook it up to rail for East Asia. You just wait and see. But as with Piraeus, as with so many of their other projects, they bring in Chinese firms. The country that it's being built in doesn't get any suppliers, don't get any new contracts out of it. And they don't all act so nicely to the local population either. So there is some rumblings that they might even be evicted from Piraeus, but it's another case study. The road is not going without a blip. They really need to handle on getting more jobs where they're doing this work to the people from that country and getting local suppliers more contracts.
Mm-hmm.
So here's somewhere where I found some numbers that were just really widely disparate. Foreign direct investment.
Before you go on, how's that any different than the American Afghanistan and Iraq model? Seriously. Everyone wants to complain about how bad the Chinese treat the Africans, and the other two relevant points that you just made. Of course, Greece is going to vote against the EU at every single available opportunity because they just, I mean, the EU just destroyed them through austerity. I mean, literally to the tune of putting over 35% of the people in food insecurity and starving them to death for fake bailouts to pay German and Swedish bondholders. I mean, it's preposterous. And then you have Viktor Orban in Hungary, who runs a really neo-fascist right-wing platform. Of course, Hungary is going to attempt to spit in the face of the EU at every opportunity possible over immigration policy. The Chinese mining holdings in the Congo, I think the Chinese have 12 of the 15 largest mining companies in the Congo, and those people are being treated horribly. So everybody is right to criticize Chinese labor practices. It's a lot easier to get away with it with your own population, right? So the Chinese have people jumping off of Foxconn factories in Shenzhen and committing suicide because of how horrible the conditions are there. But the way that they've been able to get away with a lot of this is there is a sort of national pride, and it is about erasing the 100 years of shame. The gorgeous thing about this writing that you just put down for the public, one thing that's so beautiful is people don't understand over the last 4,000 or 5,000 years, the global hegemon has always been China or India, and sometimes both. These last 2 or 3 centuries of Western intervention, that's the anomaly. That's the blip on the radar. So the idea that it wouldn't go back to what it's always been is just preposterous. So I say all that to say, the West and the United States in particular can bloviate all they want about human rights violations, but when it comes to treating people terribly and not paying them fairly, how is that any different from what they've just done in the Middle East the last 30 years? Or in South America since the Monroe Doctrine? The United States has no standing to tell China how to treat other people when it comes to labor practices or making investments. So I don't know. At some point, they're going to have to call a spade a spade.
Yes, after the West did nothing to prevent the Rwanda,
Yeah, that's right.
a million people genocide,
Mhm.
this responsibility to protect doctrine
Yeah,
from Samantha Power and Susan Rice, I believe, were leaders of that idea. And
that's right.
since it was black people and developing, quote unquote,
Black women. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that too. Right.
I mean, yeah, since Rwanda was black people, that might have been a factor in why they were so slow to respond. But then when they developed that that ideology, they were not hesitant to, and later Yugoslavia. What was their rationale? The ethnic cleansing of the Kosovars in Kosovo. What grew in the aftermath of the NATO war in Yugoslavia? Camp Bondsteel, one of the places in Kosovo, built by, drumroll please, Halliburton. And
shocking surprise, Liz Cheney and Dad.
And Libya, one of the most advanced countries in Africa, countries with the best social security and development and economic stability for the people,
Yeah.
was destroyed, and now open air slave markets back on the continent of Africa.
Right.
And it's kind of fallen out of the news, but Greeks was the G. Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain. So Northern Europe and Western Europe saddled the countries with debt.
That's
and
right.
then go tut and say that, oh, you guys in your warm climate, you just like to laze about and get free money and not pay it back, when they were saddled with peon banks. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, when they see a benefactor like China that's willing to take on some of their debt, they're responsive.
Mm-hmm.
So next, I looked at some foreign direct investment figures, and I found them to be quite disparate from one another. CNBC, for the Beltway bubble in DC, they said that in 2019, the United States received $251 billion in foreign direct investment, while China attracted $140 billion. 2020, China gets 160. States only brings in 130.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I get it. China's share of foreign direct investment worldwide is increasing while America's declining. But then to find an actual figure, I saw some Lloyd's Bank numbers that said that the fourth largest recipient of enforcement and got $852 billion in the first half of 2021. I don't know. That's pretty different numbers, but I think the overall point of China's relative share of the international pool,
Yeah.
investment increasing while the U.S. share is declining, still obtains. And Trading Economics, a website, and a lot of this is linked to in stonefruit.substack.com. They said that in the first, there was a 25% increase, $9 billion of foreign direct investment. And look at the progress they're making on Made in China 2025, because that FDI went to high-tech industry, up 52%, high-tech manufacturing, service industry, up 57%.
Yeah.
So U.S.-China relations were rocky under the Biden presidency, and we talked about how they did not really improve under the Biden administration either. The first debacle. China, they are no longer the low-skilled workhouse of the world, offloading all that to Southeast Asia and Africa.
Absolutely. That's going, Indonesia, Micronesia, Bangladesh. Yeah, it's everywhere it can go, it's going. Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam is growing.
Cambodia is starting bicycles.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Right.
They've got garment bicycles. They're moving up the chain too. Everybody's moving up the chain.
Exactly. Yep.
China's thrown all that to other people.
Yeah.
And China still has the second largest number of billionaires. I'm going to say their second number. If you be a billionaire, do not attract too much attention. Look at the cautionary tale of Alibaba tycoon Jack Ma.
Right.
He was about to spin off Ant Group, his fintech holding.
Sure.
In an October 2020 speech, he criticized China's regulatory structure and financial services. So he was disappeared for 3 months.
Right.
And then you didn't see much of him for 2020, throughout 2020.
He doesn't want to get killed.
Yeah, I think they told him messages: enjoy your billions, do not criticize the government.
Yeah, exactly. Don't glorify capital flight. when it
I think
exactly, yeah.
And this is a quote from Rob Johnson, who we just played his speech, his talk with Sachs, and he claims that members of Congress, the Supreme Court, and the Obama cabinet, $6.5 billion, or were worth. Now, he gives this unspecified category of China government advisors and national people's Congress members. He says 203 categories are worth 70. So
More
we
than
think
10
we're living,
times the amount. Yeah.
yeah, we're living in a plutocracy and an anarchy here in America, to be sure, but they live in an even wealthier plutocracy. The people at the top are really, really rich.
Well, I mean, it's one of the most relevant things that Julian Assange says when he was still allowed to speak publicly before he was sentenced to death without a trial. He said the Chinese way is just the Silicon Valley way. The Chinese way just is the American way. It's just with Chinese people and less bureaucracy. They have a more pliable populace. That's the only reason they're able to get away with faster what they do. But the Chinese way is the Silicon Valley way. All these social scores, shutting your money off. I mean, it's already made its way over here with the trucker strikes. I mean, there were legitimate people's finances that just got shut off immediately because they said something the government didn't like.
And the Chinese Communist Party, they know they have to deliver material advancement. And that's why the Chinese people, they know they can't talk about politics. They know it's censored. But because so much of what you mentioned earlier in the podcast, cost of living is heavily socialized, that means to a large extent the government is in important ways looking after their well-being.
Yeah.
Definition of democracy, where it's democracies, aging democracies like in the United States, we don't think we live in a democracy. And it's clear that we don't, because our representatives in government work for the donor class, and that's
it. Yeah.
Very clear. So now let's look at how China's development has affected who might be their allies in East Asia and Asia as a whole. Back to our old buddy Mearsheimer, and he said that the pivot to Asia isn't sure it is, but he said India, Japan, that India, Japan, Philippines, South Korea, and Vietnam are going to stick. North Korea and Pakistan are going to side with China over. I don't think that's right. Let's, for example, look at the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. There are alternatives to the TP. Who signed up right away?
It's funny because it's not even an alternative. It is the TPP. They just reversed it for their polarity. Like, we did all the work for them. They just took all the language that was out there and changed it to their partner countries. It's hilarious. It's like the ultimate Saturday Night Live gag. Yeah, right.
And they environmental stuff or labor rights stuff.
Yeah.
ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, plus China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India.
Yeah.
All these people that America thinks are its Asia's allies in Asia
Distance matters. Resources.
And
matter.
that is an economic consortium.
That's right.
That is a real consortium. The recently signed Pacific Economic Framework is just vaporware. And
Right.
the powers that be in Washington, D.C. might want to look at who voted against or who, and telling them to get out of Ukraine. Now we're going to depart away from China, but the Russia-China dyad is becoming so important. Let's look at the Russia-China dyad for a little bit.
Yeah.
Particularly Sakhalin and resources available there. Japan's a big investor. India's a big investor. South Korea is already getting most of what's coming out of Sakhalin. And Japan and India and Australia and even the United States are getting their share too. But Mersheimer didn't mention Australia. Let's talk a bit about Australia side with. They're a resource export dependent economy. And I knew that as a general factoid. But when I looked at their website, my God, they're really obsessed with their resource sector. I'll just blow through some quotes from the Australian government about their resource sector. It's over 8% of Australia's economy. $264 billion and 70% of Australia's goods exports. Quote, resource commodities make up 6 of Australia's top 10 goods. Iron ore, coal, natural gas, gold, aluminum, and petroleum. So I'm trying to rack my brain on what the other 4 are, Mark. My money on wine, wool, and mutton. And I couldn't think of the...
Yeah, lots of sheeps. Yeah.
That's why mutton. It's been a huge source of investment.
And their wine is terrible.
Well, you're the restaurateur. You speak with more authority. It's all right. But their resource sector also is a big source of foreign direct investment, $720 billion since 2005. And in 2017, this is still quotes from the website, that they broke world records for the longest uninterrupted world because of the resource sector. And that came during the downturn from 2007 to 2010. Wages are double what they are the rest of Australia. So really quite obsessed with it. Let's see if I can find another element. Them. Not that one. Not that one. Australia. Okay. This should pop it up. Is it demonstrated?
Not yet.
Australian exports over the years late. Keep jogging right along. Oh wait, there it is. Oh.
Yeah, that's good. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can see that it fluctuates a bit, but it kind of a general band of 12 billion to, let's say, 14 billion Australian.
Yep.
And to convert that to USD, just times by 0.6. So it's a good little earner.
Yeah, that's right.
A good little earner for down under.
Yeah.
But so yeah, Mearsheimer did not mention Australia, but it bears. Let's take a deeper dive into Sakhalin. I keep wanting to call it Sakhalin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they have been called in a top field in the world. West China field of Iraq with an estimated 14 billion barrels of oil.
Wow.
And Gas was the primary owner of Sakhalin 1. There's 2 iterations of development there now. And they pulled out after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but I wonder, because they said, well, we're pulling out, heinous atrocity, naughty Russia, but we need to protect the safety of the workers, we need to protect the environment, and we need to make sure that the existing clients are served in the transition. I wonder if just using that as an excuse until the geopolitical tensions cool off and they just remain the #1 owner of Sakhalin 1. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right.
And a majority of the gas that leaves the Strait of Hormuz goes to Asia. 60 from China. Now, those are Persian Gulf is surrounded by enormous oil fields, but they're maturing, and something enormous that's just starting to be tapped, and that is so geographically proximate.
Yeah.
Hungry nations as Japan, South Korea, China.
Japan made it known almost immediately that they would not be participating in a meaningful way in sanctioning pipeline oil because of Sakhalin.
Yeah. Do you have some intel on the pipelines? To the best of my knowledge, the pipelines so far only go to China. And they're working on one to South Korea. And I don't know what the state of play is from Sakhalin to Japan. To the best of my knowledge.
I thought there was going to be where Japan's most northern islands are. I'm almost certain. Yeah, I'm almost certain there is a planned, almost done drop spot on the northernmost islands of Japan.
That would make sense. Bring it in at Hokkaido, their northernmost main island.
That's right. Yeah, it's very close. That's right. Yes.
Because part of the challenge of drilling in Sakhalin Islands is that they're very deep. 9 of the 10 deepest wells are in. But I think any overarching view has to look at the importance of Sakhalin to China, South Korea, and Japan's energy needs, and look at the ever-closening dyad of China, Russia. So I think people like Mearsheimer are wrong when they say that all those people are going to stay with them. Japan and China, Japan and South Korea, and there's some consumption charts at Substack. They took a little dip for the pandemic, but let's assume that they bounce back. And the figures are that they're using, let's say, around 35 barrels a day. $14 billion, a billion barrels is going to satisfy even the demands of those energy-hungry countries for quite a while to come.
Well, and that's another major point that you bring up consistently in your work, and it's something that I find spot on and provocative. When you give credit to the work of Alfred McCoy, especially on his work around Mackinder, it brings all of this Belt Road into play. So right now, we're in a global food crisis because of Russia, Ukraine. But people don't understand that one of the largest phosphate reserves, I think, is Morocco. So when you constantly reference these oil pipelines and McCoy and Mackinder, and it becomes blatantly obvious how interconnected Africa, Europe, Eurasia, and Asia are. It's all one landmass at the end of the day. So the Chinese creating a new Silk Road of trade, this is going to integrate energy, fertilizer, rice, wheat, like all, and then even on the technology platforms, they're going to have all the semiconductors, the supercomputers, the high capacity fiber wire. I mean, it just makes sense why every polarity keeps being magnetized and pushed that direction. To fight it is lunacy. It's not practical.
Yeah, the Belt and Road is not just high-speed rail, natural gas and oil pipelines, and Silk Roads as well. It's also broadband along those exact same corridors. So we need to look at the importance of cutting-edge telecommunications as well. And I think a good kind of punctuation in anyone's timeline considering contemporary technology is that in 2007, the iPhone was introduced. In 2012, Facebook had its IPO. And as we mentioned a little earlier, the biggest market cap companies are Apple, Google, and that builds upon Robert Spalding's thesis in his examination of War Without Rules, is that the Chinese leadership looks, quote, at finance, economics, and data as more important than kinetic war. China uses transactions, trade, academics, and for their own interests. And if you want to invest in China, you have to have a local partner. The local partner has access to all of the intellectual property involved in the partnership. And lately, and the rhetoric's getting pretty heated, intellectual property from the United States, but they still keep sending their students to the universities where America, that's one of the last places that we're there. And Shenzhen, they allow Western expats to come in with their entrepreneurial talent, but everybody knows the game is that intellectual property rights are nominal. So
Right.
If the famous quote from Clausewitz, the great theorist of tradition, is that war is politics by other means, then China construes politics as war by other means. And because America only thinks about kinetic war, they have no way of looking at their relationship with China in any systematic way. And they security frameworks like this vaporware, like Indo-Pacific or ANZUS, which I don't think any of those will last the decade. What China's more focused on is this multi-front war, and one of their central features is the economic war, creating their own foreign trade settlement rails and their own bilateral currency swap systems completely independent of the dollar. They created the cross-border interbank payment system, SIPS, in 2015. It's their alternative to SWIFT, which all the Western banks use. And adoption's been slow, but it's there. And when MasterCard and Visa pulled out of Russia, all the Russian banks just jumped on UnionPay, China's
Yeah.
debit card.
Right. Yeah.
And their bilateral currency swaps are with Russia, Turkey, Argentina, Pakistan, and I tried to find a longer list than those four, but those are only 40 influential.
Well, I mean, Swift is slow. The transaction fees are high. It's antiquated anyway. I mean, you know, the story that the United States spins itself to keep its public peace together, the rest of the world doesn't have to put up with it or deal with it. Everybody else just tells the truth. Every time the sanctions regime takes hold somewhere else, it ends up only costing higher transaction fees to the United States' own citizenry. Everybody else just immediately adjusts because the monopolies are so antiquated. And they've been being threatened for so long, they don't care anymore. They already knew it was a possibility. I mean, if you tell someone every single day you're going to sock them in the nose for a month, they're going to be prepared for when you actually sock them in the nose. It's not even going to matter at that point. So that's what every other civilized country, that's what every other modern industrial country is already doing that does not want to bow down to the terms of the IMF.
Yes. And Brother Mark, you and I have nearly wrestled a 7,200 word essay to the ground. And we've passed the 2-hour mark, so we can come to a conclusion pretty soon. But
close it out strong, brother.
I'm going to close it. I'm going to have a good kick in this foot race. So the dollar is still dominant, right? The 40% of global debt, 2/3 of the global GDP, 40% of SWIFT payments, and denominated in dollars.
Yeah.
Let's slide of the ledger. The yuan is only 3% of SWIFT payments in January of this year. Only 30% of China's, even their own debt, is denominated in yuan.
Right.
According to the IMF, the yuan is only 2.9% of global reserves, so it's not a strong reserve currency yet. Although the recent UBS bank survey said that central banks are interested in holding it, and they envision in a decade. I think the de-dollarization could happen a lot more quickly than that. I think because the financial and fintech infrastructure is already there, it could happen really quickly. And the war in Ukraine is pushing it in that direction. But I think when it finally gets momentum, it could happen a lot faster than anyone thinks.
Yeah.
And China, in the early days of cryptocurrency, was kind of laissez-faire, hands off, and there wasn't a lot of regulation. But then when it became too important to ignore, they said, whoa, hey, whoa, everybody stop, we'll take over. So they outlawed trading crypto and mining crypto and put some real focus and people power into figuring out what it is. And as a result, their digital currency is pretty far ahead of the game. And I sat in on a Bank of International Settlements online conference in March. And Bank of International Settlements is kind of the central banker's central bank. And a lot of the breakout sessions dealt with central bank digital currencies.
Yeah.
And China's in the lead because they shut it all down because they didn't understand it. Now they do understand it. Now they're in the lead. In this and previous podcasts, we've been talking a lot about how it's kind of the West versus BRICS and Belt and Road country. And the West, I'd call, and there's a lot of overlap, I'd call it NATO, the Schengen, that's a lot of overlap. The Anglo-American settler colonial states, who are all the Five Eyes signal intelligence countries.
Yeah.
America, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. The Trilateral Coalition, which is Japan, the US, and Europe.
Yeah.
And South integrated into all these multilateral organizations too, because they just NATO Cyber Command.
Yeah.
And of course, Argentina has been formally invited to join BRICS. And if we look at the members of BRICS New Development Bank, that includes, besides BRICS, Bangladesh, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Uruguay. So you pull in.
And the other cool thing that you just said, why wouldn't Argentina be invited when all of their debt that they already know they cannot pay is denominated in dollars, simultaneously coinciding with the previous NATO, what was considered a partner country, Colombia, finally ousting its oligarchy and plutocracy and putting in place a leftist that is clearly going to be hostile to neoliberal policies from the United States.
Yeah, and let's look at that list of people besides BRICS who are members of the BRICS' own. Because then you pull in some Arabs and Muslim countries, which they don't yet have. Well, India has a very substantial Muslim population, but it's not majority Muslim. And he is also a major financial center. So if they can pull in some Muslim and or Arab countries like UAE, Egypt, that would really diversify BRICS' appeal to the rest of the world and the countries to keep an eye on after Argentina ascends to BRICS.
Certainly.
And renowned Western world systems analyst Emmanuel Paulers suggests another split, which is between the elite, Davos man, who we refer to often, and the World Social Forum, especially that really famous one in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 2005. And they manifesto and decides there how the elite continues to replicate their advantages within an evolving globalization versus a egalitarian, ecologically sound, social democratic vision that has a really robust social civil liberties. Jumping back to another same future that Jeffrey Sachs suggests. I don't have the element for this, so I'll try and imitate him. He does, it's kind of Detroit meets Wisconsin meets. What do we do to get to the good future technologies to end poverty like China has done? It can be everywhere. We use these technologies to end the backbreaking physical labor that still burdens a lot of people around the world. We use these technologies to make sure that everyone can get health care, education, public services, banking, and payments because it's on their phones. Have smart systems that can help everybody. I'm asking the question all the time. What can we do to get to the good outcome? Being absolutely clear in my mind that that outcome is possible if we don't take care. That's why we need active government, rich oligarchs, or to the market alone, or to any one country. We need a cooperative effort. That's world, use our know-how for the benefit of everybody. We can do it peacefully, and we can do it together, and we can do it in an environmentally sustainable manner. That's the world we should be. That's the hopeful future.
Yeah.
It sounds like fucking utopia, Mark French.
Well, I mean, but when you say that though, that's what's so cool about this. Everybody's trying to get at it in a roundabout way because the conversation has been taken away from Americans since basically post World War II, right? So we align with the Russians to go against the Nazis during World War II. But you're talking about a language that was taken out by the McCarthy scare from our language and lexicon and learning. That's not the case in Asia. They know who the Ordo liberals are. They know who the Austrians are. These have been open conversations the entire time. So just because Americans cannot differentiate between classical economists from the neoclassicals, China does. And they've picked what works from everywhere and stuck it together for the benefit of their own people and growth. That hasn't happened here in a very long time. And it's what is growing this chasm on steroids and exponentiating the split. It's why it looks so different right now. Open conversations.
There is absolutely no there is absolutely no reason why the West cannot join hands with the BRICS and Belt and Road countries to create something much more Porto Alegre manifesto, much more like Jeffrey Sachs's sane vision of a world partnership for the betterment of the people.
That's right.
Instead, all America has in mind is more war.
Right.
I'm going to pass over it and I direct our viewers to stonefruit.substack.com, where I looked at the 2023 Department of Defense budget request, and they have a plan to try and counter China's rise in East Asia, but militarily, not diplomatically, not working together for the betterment of all of our mutual citizenry.
Yeah, not education, not engineering. Right. Yeah, there's no real competition. It's do what we say or we'll bomb you.
I looked at a document from the comptroller of the Defense Department describing the Pacific Defense Initiative. Hideous, but characteristics, pragmatism and realism. And it is the only state that is also undeniably a culture. And because it's so obsessed with its dynastic tradition, weapon. And for all of the warmongering America wants to do to it, its goals geopolitically are rather modest. They want respect. They want everyone to say we are in a multipolar world. They want the rule of international law, except where it applies to South China Sea, because the Philippines applied to the International Court of Arbitration about how they were militarizing some of the islands in the South China Sea, and the ruling came against China, and China said, fuck off. So mostly the rule of international law. They don't want to be, they don't want to be lectured to about human rights or democracy affairs. And they want prominence in the first island chain and the second chain. They don't want that partnership that Sachs imagined is not impossible. And in fact, a lot of these goals are in the Atlantic Charter that we talked about in our last episode.
That's right.
The Western governments modeled and led by America, they're just run as a plutocracy for the advantage of the rich And
Yeah, and they have to have someone to blame. As this thing unravels and unspins, and there's no will to address any of the root causes here, they have to have a boogeyman. That's really all it is.
yeah, it's funny you mentioned Alfred McCoy. I actually just borrowed his newest book from the library, Ashland, and I'm road trip, so I gotta get myself back to Jackson County so I can return that book. And they had a chapter on China, and they had a chapter on Pax Americana. It's of course top notch McCoy, but what he points out is very true, that because China is a very self-referential culture. Yeah, no shit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you know what this does? It makes them totally incapable of creating any kind of soft power to work with power and hard power. And one of America's most important secret weapons of the 20th century. China doesn't have it. And their model of high-tech totalitarianism is not an attractive social model. So they've got no, they're too self-referential. Their social order at home through high-tech surveillance does not appeal to the people. It appeals to some of the leaders of some countries.
Of course, yeah, including ours.
Yeah.
Silicon Valley invented it.
And another thing that is going to make their secession as the global hegemon after America, and it's coming.
Yeah.
Make no mistake.
Right.
But it's going to be brief. They don't have those two key elements, and because of the crushing environmental damage that they have done to themselves and the world.
Of course. Yeah.
As 40-plus year economic miracle. And China's not the only guilty player, but it is the major emitter of one of the major emitters of greenhouse gases. And the Paris Accords of 2015, they were voluntary limits, and they wanted us to not go past 2 degrees Celsius from industrial level world temperatures.
Right.
Well, I think we're going to blow past 2% Celsius. And if we do, in the near future, Bangladesh 6 degrees above sea level, there's 200 million people that are going to get flooded. Where are they going? Persian Gulf and North China Plain. North China Plain is their agricultural and industrial heartland and the most densely populated place on the planet.
Yeah.
They are going to be seen after we surge past 2 degrees Celsius wet bulb temperature. And when you reach wet bulb temperature, a healthy adult will drop dead in 6 hours outside because they can't even cool off by sweating.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, you just. Yep.
Proceed.
You gave the numbers. I mean, that's really, it's going to be interesting. You brought up so many relevant points of how this is going to unspin itself, right? Like, they don't have the energy that they need because of the one-child policy for so long, which they were too late to switch to the two-child. Then they industrialized so quickly and grew so quickly that the workers that went from the farm or the rice paddy into the city to assemble all of these electronics, they were paid so poorly and treated so poorly. Like the stresses that you brought up, how they choose to handle it will be the question of the next century of how this thing gets unspun. The United States produces a lot of energy, is hydrocarbons specifically, and it only has less than 5% of the population of the whole planet. China can't produce its own power. So what is Australia and New Zealand going to do? Are they going to be looked at as traitors to their own people and continually sell all of their resources and goods to China? Like, how much is China going to be able to vacuum over this next 50 years, right? If no one trusts their money or they have big social problems at home. So I think that's really the crux and the apex and the beautiful thing about this piece that you wrote. It's so interesting. This is the most relevant social experiment of the last 2 centuries and how this is going to play out. They have a huge demographics problem. They're going to get so old so fast, but they're so educated and they've built so much so fast. If they let their population just continue to age and die out, but they have such a high quality of life, they can import all the doctors and nurses they'll ever need to take care of their aging population from Africa and India and Bangladesh and the Philippines. Like, what are they going to do about immigration? Like, when the Chinese story is forced to stop being just Han Chinese just because of their basic necessity of they don't have the labor force anymore. They all aged out. How are they going to address this? So however they choose to handle it, it's going to be relevant to a lot of other countries that are aging in the same manner. Japan, places like that. I'm very curious to see how this plays out. South Korea, you know, the United States is proposing to build a wall on its southern border, but it's not making enough babies either. Germany, I mean, there's a lot of countries that aren't making enough children to sustain their current models, but they're adverse or fervently opposed to immigration. Those two things don't go together.
Yes. So some self-inflicted wounds have created collapse in the United States. Some self-inflicted wounds will create some collapse in China.
Yeah.
But for a brief moment, they are going to think that they have redeemed that century of humiliation. From the Opium Wars on, blip in their 5,000 years of mission, and for a few brief shining decades, global warming starts baking everyone who lives between the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers to death.
Right. Yep.
This has been of the Hardline According to Stonefruit with you and Mark French. Thank you, Internet people, and goodbye.
Bye.